I grew up being very inquisitive about life. My mother says that on that particular day, they gave her a cesarean section without and her husband of anesthesia had abandoned her with two children. The violence that all of the skin came off my face, trauma. Sometimes I would listen to. I remember just being a kid that all you would see was my dog. Are you crazy? Put that thing back, running around with the dope in his mouth. Hi, my name is Cindy Brown Austin. I am a Hartford native. I was born in Connecticut, which is one of the richest states, one of the third richest per capita states in the country. I've had a very interesting experience in the land of plenty. I started writing several years ago because I thought it was important to preserve the memories and the legacy of the things that I saw while growing up, specifically in the Charter Oak Terrace housing project in Hartford. And I basically represent a generation that for the most part was basically wiped out through a number of things. Just to tell you a little bit about my life, I was born 1964 to a single mom who was on welfare on the worst snowstorm day in December in a hospital called McCook Hospital, which was known as the Butcher Hospital. My mother says that on that particular day, they gave her a cesarean section without the benefit of anesthesia. And I think it was sort of a herald of things to come for me. She talks about how she stayed in the hospital and how 3 different men came to the hospital to see who I looked like, because no one was really sure who I belonged to. Finally decided on the man who was my dad. And on the day that my mother was to be discharged from the hospital, it was a terrible snowstorm. My father was supposed to come pick her up, and he never arrived. So she came down from her hospital room where they put all the welfare mothers in one big room. It was a large ward. She came down with her suitcase, and she had me in her other arms. She sat in the lobby of the hospital during the snowstorm for hours, did not have a ride, didn't have a way home. And once she would get home, there would be no heat in her apartment. Finally, a Caucasian couple saw her sitting there for hours, and they asked her, they said, "Miss, do you need a ride home?" And my mother said, "Yes, I do." And so, thank God for this couple. The wife said, "I'll take the baby and you carry the suitcase." And my mom said, "No, you carry the suitcase and I'll carry the baby." Brought me home to an apartment that did not have any heat, but we had love. And my mom, kind of put me in the bed with her. And that was sort of the early beginnings of my childhood. Later on, she would be very honest with me about some of the things that she felt. At that time in 1964, for African American women, especially, my mom had 2 other children. She had married at 14, and her husband had abandoned her with 2 children. So in all, there would be 4 daughters that my mom would have. He would abandon her when she was 18 and just kind of leave her. And so by the time my mom had me, it was a situation where she was a maid. She did domestic work, and she fell into an affair with this married man. And that's how I began. She would talk about what it was like to have postpartum blues. And at that time, no one talked about postpartum blues. But later she would tell me how she had these desires to throw me out of the window, to take me and to put me into a scalding hot tub of water. She didn't know what caused her to have these feelings. She'd hear these voices. And she called my dad, who was a West Indian who believed in roots. And he told her to take a bath in herbs. And I thank God he was looking out for me even as an infant. She didn't throw me out of the window. I'm glad about that. Later on, my older sister would babysit me, and she had a strong urge, and she later talked about this, to put me in the oven. And I said, oh my goodness, somebody was looking out for me at that time. When I was about 13 months old, I was in a walker, and I poured hot grease on myself, burnt my face completely. All of the skin came off my face, and I still have some of the scars to show for my curiosity. And that sort of just the kind of early beginnings of my life. When I was 3 months old, my mother moved myself, my two older sisters, and later she would have another illegitimate child with a different man. But she moved us into a place called Charter Oak Terrace Housing Project. Ironically, although my mom was not an educated woman, she had an 8th grade education, but as a maid, as a domestic, she would watch the way that the mothers in West Hartford, how they trained their children, how they bought the most expensive educational toys. And she would instinctively, she'd tell us how sometimes she would take her entire paycheck and just buy these Fisher-Price toys, these toys that would challenge our minds. And so we grew up in the project, but with a mindset that was sort of different from the other children in the project. I grew up being very inquisitive about life. Instinctively, my mother would surround us with books. We had all kinds of encyclopedias, Childcraft, Britannica, all kinds of nursery rhymes and Aesop's fables and fairy tales. And so I grew up with just a voracious appetite for words. I loved to read and would spend hours, all day long with a book. I would be somewhat embarrassed because my mom I remember I was 5, 6 years old, and she would make me follow her to the bookmobile. Now, we didn't have a car, and so the bookmobile would come out to the projects every Thursday, and we would go and we would get books. I was so embarrassed because it seemed like nobody else had to do that on a hot summer day, and I wanted to hide the books from my friends. I had no idea that my mom was instinctively preparing me for a time that when the project would sort of become this place that would be just formidable, and the violence that we saw, the psychological trauma that we'd experienced. And because she had introduced me to a world of books, that was the place that I could just resort to. I could sit on my step in the project, and we lived right in the middle of the projects. I could sit there all day long, and it was better than HBO. All of the sex you wanted to see, the violence, the action, the adventure. I would sit there and just watch and just listen to the voices and the rhythms of the neighborhood. I would smell the chicken frying, the fish frying, the Latino food, the rice and beans, the curry goat, all of these different cultures that existed in the project. But also, I would listen to the way people spoke, to the cadences of language, the rhythms of language. Sometimes my mom would send me over to the number runner, and she would play the street lottery, and she'd give me 50 cents on a scrap of paper, and I would go to this man's house, and he smelled of urine. He'd have a holster with his gun under his arm, and he would write numbers for the mafia. And he was hard of hearing, and so I'd give him the scrap of paper. He'd say, 20 or 30 for 50 and 60. He never heard me. I always had to say it 2 or 3 times, and he would always reach into his pocket and give me a quarter when I left. I loved visiting him. Next door to us was a lady who was a gambler. Her name was Tomcat. She was part Cherokee Indian, one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. She looked like a heavy-set Lena Horne. She had beautiful hair down her back, was very fair-skinned. She had this household where they would gamble all hours of the night, especially on Friday. And people would come through there with names like Dr. Buzzard. And preachers would come there, and sometimes they would bring her, they would collect money from her for their churches. And this lady, I'm told, would sit and she wouldn't wear underwear. And so she would make the men lose their money because their mind would be on what was going on under the table as opposed to on top of the table. They had this dog that was huge German Shepherd that they would feed gunpowder to make him mean. And he lived next door to us. And so every so often he would get loose. And I would have to figure out a way to get to my house and to get inside without this dog who was always ill-tempered and would attack you. And he got me a few times. The project life was just this world that was indescribable. And the amazing thing was there was no way when we would leave the projects for a day, we would go downtown where Mainstream was, where there was a lot of Caucasian people. We boarded on West Hartford, which is a very affluent town in Connecticut. And if you drove past our projects, all you would see was a slum. You'd see dumpsters overflowing. You would see these dilapidated tenements. And you had no idea what the humanity was like inside the project. You had no idea what the children were dealing with day to day inside the projects. You had no idea that there was trauma there that was so intense that oftentimes when we left the project for a day, we always had to go back. But we'd go downtown and we'd go to shop in some of the stores and we would be so loud. Or when we went to school, we would walk in these mobs because we were little kids like in kindergarten going to school and there was nobody to guard us. And there would be old men in cars who would call out to us and offer us candy to get in the cars with them. And the only ones there to protect us would be the safety patrollers. And they were little boys who were close to our age, and they wore these little banners across their chests, and they were our fathers, and they were our big brothers, and they were, our age 9 and 10 and 7 and 8. And they were the ones who looked out for us in the projects. And so when we got to school, we were very loud. When we got to school, we were very angry. When we got to school, oftentimes we didn't know how to sit still because of the things that we saw going on in the projects. I remember many times just sitting there and, for instance, I had a best friend and I remember just being a kid, being outside. And this is, early 70s, mid 70s. And sometimes you'd be sitting there and insane people would, one man in particular, I'll never forget this. My mom had hired someone to build this beautiful picnic table. And this man, in the projects, there were people who never heard of taking medication. No one talked about schizophrenia. So a lot of people who basically would make it in the mainstream, the projects was a dumping ground for people who were insane. And every so often they would run through the project. And I never forget this man who took all his clothes off. And he had beat up his wife and beat up his children and was running through the project just wild. And he picked up our picnic table that my mother had spent all of this money for, picked it up and just crashed it and just destroyed it. I could sit there all day and watch men chase their women outside and just beat them up in the street. I could sit there and watch the drug dealer in the house next to us hide his dope in the grass and watch my dog would go and get the dope and be running around with the dope in his mouth. And many times I'd grab the dope because I was so inquisitive.